Merci beaucoup d'avoir donné l'opportunité de participer par Skype et je m'excuse comme d'habitude pour faire mon intervention en anglais, mais je crois que dans ce cas-là, c'est plus intéressant peut-être parce que Pichon-Rivière, c'est une figure qui n'a pas été traduite en anglais, alors ça sera une façon de l'introduire un peu plus dans le monde anglophone. Mais quand même, la discussion peut être en français. Et merci beaucoup à tous. Et voilà, je lis. From Vulnerability to Learning, Introducing the Thought of Enrique Pichon-Rivière. In the aftermath of September 11th, the American philosopher and critic Judith Butler spoke of vulnerability as one of the most important resources from which we must take our bearings and find our way. That was, I quote now, "From where might a principle emerge," she asks, "by which we vow to protect others from the kinds of violence we have suffered, if not from an apprehension of common human vulnerability?" Unquote. What is implicit in the argument, I think, is that vulnerability can be a source of orientation when recognized in the other, yet from a position that is, with respect to this other, not equally vulnerable. This difference is crucial, for from the perspective of vulnerability itself, there is no bearing to be found. It is the experience itself of disorientation. Thus, we vow to protect others, not because we know ourselves to be vulnerable, but because we know ourselves at a given moment to be less vulnerable than them. That is what I'm adding to the argument of the common vulnerability. This perhaps explains why Butler needs to move in her essay from a discussion of vulnerability to a discussion of the recognition of vulnerability, leading to the conclusion that the only vulnerability that can give bearings is one that is recognized. I quote, "A vulnerability must be perceived and recognized in order to come into play in an ethical encounter. And there is no guarantee that this will happen," unquote. In other words, we cannot speak about vulnerability without speaking of a bond, to anticipate a concept that I will discuss later. In Butler's essay, entitled Violence, Mourning, Politics, two types of bond are at play. On the one hand, there is a sibling horizontal bond in which Butler adopts the perspective of Antigone seeking to bury the dead. Her argument in this part of the essay is that the victims of the retaliation are not going to be portrayed and are not recognized as vulnerable, so their victimhood doesn't count. So her attempt is to just bring recognition, or to say if the vulnerability of the victims are not recognized in the first place, then their victimhood is not going to count. So that would be what I'm calling the Antigone perspective. And on the other hand, there is a vertical maternal bond from which we apprehend that vulnerability needs to be adopted as our own, not in the sense that we identify with it, erasing all difference, which would make the vow of protection impossible, but in the sense that we take responsibility for it, a responsibility that could become overwhelming and perhaps paralyzing if it were not shared, again horizontally, and to continue with the parental metaphor, if it were not transitory. When speaking of a common human vulnerability, it is important to dwell on another difference, which in a sense is the same difference, that could also be distributed along the horizontal and vertical axis. That between vulnerability as sheer mortality and vulnerability related to the condition of being born prematurely and thus needing the care of others to survive. That primary Hilflosigkeit, helplessness, détresse en français, which has always been the concern of psychoanalysis, inscribes mortality in the psyche. Unlike mortality, however, Hilflosigkeit is an experience that can reappear is a condition, that we normally grow out of, even if it remains a powerful pattern of experience that can reappear in adult life. A state of permanent helplessness generally denounces a failure of the bond and or a psychophysic incapacity, a failure of the institutions of protection, and demands a therapeutic. The Argentine psychoanalyst and psychiatrist Enrique Pichon-Rivière, born in 1907 in Switzerland, actually in Geneva, and who died in 1977 in Buenos Aires, found in this regression to a primordial helplessness, often triggered by a feeling of insecurity and uncertainty, which was triggered socially, which was felt in society, the model of pathology. Pichon-Rivière developed a theory according to which all pathological manifestations, psychotic or neurotic, were understood as failed attempts to learn from and adapt actively. Here, actively is more important than the adaptation to reality. Perhaps it's not more important, but just so that we don't confuse the terms. So such active adaptation, which corresponds to what Stigler calls adoption, more than what he calls adaptation, supposes an elaboration of primary helplessness. Pichon-Rivière began to write in Buenos Aires in the early 1930s, a time of massive demographic change and urbanization. The main wave of European immigration had come to Argentina between 1870 and 1930, roughly. And I think that in 1920, the population of Buenos Aires was half of the population of Buenos Aires were immigrants who had come mainly from Italy and Spain, but also other parts of Europe. And in the midst of what became known as the infamous decade, the Década Infame, of authoritarian regimes inaugurated by the coup of Uriburu a year after the Wall Street crisis of 1929. The sinister climate of conspiracy and corruption that characterized this era is probably best portrayed in Pichon's friend, the writer Roberto Arl's two-part novel Los Siete Locos, The Seven Madmen, from 1929, and Los Lanzallamas, The Flamethrowers, from 1931. When the tortured hero commits a senseless act of brutality against a crippled woman, someone more vulnerable than him, paradoxically to exit the anguish and confusion produced by an irrational social order of gender and class oppression, or in the melancholic tangos of Enrique Santos Discépolo, which in Pichon's words carried a load, I quote, a load of ruthlessness, nostalgia, and insecurity in a progressively precarious economic situation, unquote. Taking his bearings from a vulnerability that he certainly saw as his own, Pichon, as he's called in general in Argentina, would later define the cure as a reduction of psychotic anxieties produced by every experience of change. And the model for this basic nucleus of psychotic anxiety was this primordial détresse or helplessness, which can allow for the emergence of a project. So the therapy consisted in reducing these anxieties so that a project or what we've been calling a dream can emerge. In his progressive distancing from psychoanalysis, from orthodox psychoanalysis to social psychology, but a social psychology that we shouldn't confuse with the social psychology that developed in the United States, although he did read many of the authors associated with that, especially Kurt Lewin, or Lewin, I don't know how you pronounce it. Pichon found the group to be an appropriate structure to fulfill this function of what Donald Winnicott calls holding. I would like to introduce Pichon-Rivière's figure and thought to our discussion because his lifetime's work as a pedagogue, cultural critic, builder of institutions, he was part of the founding group of the Argentinian Psychoanalytic Association in 1942, for example. Then he left the association. He founded a research center that was very interesting, experimental. Then he founded his own school of social psychology, which is now continued by his widow, Ana Pampliega de Quiroga. And so he built numerous institutions. He was also a psychiatrist and theoretician. Is exemplary of that vow of protection that an apprehension of common vulnerability demands. A vow that he translated into a praxis and a legacy that could help us apprehend and alleviate the individual and social pathologies of a time when life again is increasingly precarious. Pichon-Rivière was a lover of jazz and a melancholic who prescribed a planning of hope as a remedy and a technique of survival that required a strategy, tactics, logistics, and a group effort. That is, a making of hope into a pretension, which, however, included our finitude. He said we must be able to elaborate a project that includes our own death within the project. For this, he developed a therapeutic tool that he called the ECRO, ECRO, conceptual, referential, and operative schema, and which consisted of a flexible set of parameters with which to apprehend the situation, which needed to be operative. I think that's a key term in this ECRO, that is effective in intervening in the situation as well as modifiable by the situation. Pichon-Rivière's family emigrated from France to the Chaco, a region in the northeast of Argentina, populated by the Guarani Indians, when Pichon was 3 years old. In different sources it says 4 years old. They wanted to cultivate cotton, yet the jungle eventually won, and the family moved to the small city of Goya in Corrientes, where Pichon found the local chapter of the Socialist Party, another institution that he started, and a football club. He was a lover of football. At 18, Pichon left to study medicine in Rosario and moved later to Buenos Aires. He left to study medicine. His mother tongue was French, and he learned Guarani from his father's foreman. Spanish, in which he wrote, was his third language. In the prologue to his collected works, which appeared in 1971, he writes that his I quote, "vocation for the sciences of man comes from the attempt to resolve the darkness of the conflict between two cultures." And he meant the Guarani and his French culture. Two cultures, the European and the indigenous, marked in different ways by loss through the ruthlessness of immigration and the devastation of colonization, yet propelled forward in a national project that had become their common destiny. The notion of conflict as constitutive of reality and as something that must be constantly negotiated in a process of integration was central to Pichon's idea of learning and of health. A situation of conflict could become dilemmatic and thus stereotyped, and here I'm using stereotype in the way that Pichon used it, which I think is quite similar to Stigler's, but not completely. For him, for Pichon, I think it was generally quite a negative or purely negative term, although not quite. We'll see later. And the stereotype in a closed circle of repetition. So where psychoanalysis has repetition compulsion, I think he reinterpreted repetition compulsion as a closed circle of stereotype. Or problematic, so it could be dilemmatic. Conflict could become dilemmatic or problematic, and thus mobilized in the dialectic spiral of learning. The therapeutic operation with respect to conflict consisted in shifting the dilemmatic to the problematic, which is, by the way, I think similar to the Kantian operation that moves from the deadlock of speculative reason to practical reason. Kant says that speculative reason is this constant oscillation in the which also corresponds to formal logic, where when you come to dialectic, also to the dialectic of pure reason, then you have a different type of process. Like Kant, he saw Pichon-Rivière saw conflict and not contradiction as a motor of learning. So that in his spiral, and he also, the reason I was so interested in introducing Pichon-Rivière is that he uses the figure of the spiral is the main figure of his teaching. So I think it's quite in the spirit of the Académie. So that in his spiral there is no contradiction between that which is closed and that which is open. There are just two necessary moments to proceed with the dialectical process. A moment, here it's a citation, sorry. A moment of certain closure is necessary for assimilation, and a moment of openness is necessary for the inclusion of new experiences that will be enriched the moment in which a new closure is produced, and so on. So here he's using the spiral not only as a model for health, but also of learning. While the maniac does not close enough to allow integration of knowledge, the epileptic is prisoner of a closed system of repetition that creates enormous pressure, which, however, could suddenly open and become a stroke of genius. So that the two are always in movement, or there is always a possibility of putting them in movement. What we can hope for in life and from the therapeutic process is that these systems are kept in movement, in a working intermittence, so that the tragicomedy to evoke Lacan may continue. In 1946, Pichon formulated a theory of a unique malady that posed the proto-depression of childhood helplessness, here we come back to vulnerability, as the origin of every pathology. Rather than as an etiology, he also had a theory of the multiple causality of pathology, so it's not that he eliminated the biological or it wasn't a reductive theory. It was more that this theory should be understood as an ethical or perhaps theological even position in the face of psychic pain. A principle that posed the possible intelligibility and thus ameliorability of the most extreme forms of madness. According to Pichon, who shifted from studying medicine to psychiatry because, unlike death, and although it is a form of death, madness can at times be reversible, everyone, even a catatonic patient, is trying to communicate something with their symptoms. He saw this task as a scientist, healer, and intellectual as to listen and to try to understand. This led him to theorize the resistances to this task on the part of the observer, and in this case, the psychiatrist, who fears to drown in the object of study, to identify with it, which would be catastrophic for both. So again, this I think should be it's a very simple concept, but I think it should be introduced in our idea of pedagogy when we're trying to think institutions, when we're trying to think a very catastrophic moment now, what the danger of this identification with the object of study, the anxieties that it produces, and how we elaborate those anxieties, either by refusing to acknowledge the catastrophic nature, so that we establish a limit, which is always our own limit. It's not a limit in the object. It's just a limit of our understanding, and that's what he says. Diagnosis for Pichon-Rivière is that limit, in a sense. The moment we say beyond this we're not going to understand, there comes diagnosis. That would be one of the options, and the other option is to identify to the point of collapsing in that helplessness. So Pichon observed that this anxiety, which he called an epistemophilic obstacle, required a therapeutic and was best managed within a group. And this is why a large part of his work was dedicated to a critique of pedagogy. Incidentally, this pathology of identification, this time with characters in popular fiction, among a class that lacked therapeutic of literature, is a phenomenon that Arlt explored in his theater. His characters are always drowning in the characters of the popular fiction that was also expanding massively in Buenos Aires at that time through translations made of a lot of French popular fiction, for example. Thus, we come to a second principle of Pichon's therapeutics, which is its indistinguishability from formation. Health is identified at all times with a capacity to learn in a way that one is transformed, but also transforms the object of study, which is reality. The pedagogic experience that lay at the root of this theory was the emergency training as nurses of the less ill patients in the then called Hospicio de las Mercedes, the main mental hospital for males in Buenos Aires, where he worked from 1936 to 1947. During this experience, which resembled that of institutional psychotherapy in Saint Alban l'Auxerre some years later, as we heard in this same academy some years ago, with the experience of Tosquelles, etc. Pichon noticed that these patients, when given a real task, improved their conditions dramatically, often working better than the professional nurses. Recognizing the isolation and abandonment that patients suffered in the hospital, as well as the objective conditions of their existence, Pichon would, in the late 1950s, and having shifted away from psychoanalysis, propose a theory of the mad as the spokesman for the anxieties of the group, mainly the family. This ill person becomes the depositary of a content which is unbearable for the group and is subsequently isolated in an attempt of the group to rid itself of its psychotic anxieties. He or she who becomes ill is then, paradoxically, the strongest member of the group, who then becomes the weakest, a bouc émissaire, but also a denouncer who by healing can also begin, here I think it's the hopeful part, by healing can also begin to heal the group and become an agent of social transformation. The artist too, according to Pichon-Rivière, is a spokesman for the group's anxiety, which is why it is bound to meet the resistance to change that Pichon found common in all groups and ego structures. Yet the artist is, like the agent of social transformation, on the way from pathology to health, having devised its own therapeutic praxis. Thus, to heal is not just to become functional again in an environment, but to be able to transform it. This progressive notion of cure should be used to give a positive interpretation of Canguilhem's. I think Canguilhem's idea is already positive, but I'm just overimposing too. To Canguilhem's idea that health is never a return to a previous state, but requires a normative act that modifies the environment. We could add that this modification is a provisional solution to a situation of conflict, which is primordial insofar as it begins with birth. Conflict begins with birth. In other words, creative and therapeutic processes yield more than they consume, producing what Stieler called infinite quantities, act horizontally across a group and vertically across time and generation. Insofar as life is a constant demand for adaptation and resolution of conflicts that would result in pathology if not addressed through a form of creativity or therapeutics, be that which lays implicit in a savoir-vivre or savoir-faire or explicitly technical, health implies negentropy. In a speech pronounced in honor of the in honor of the World Year of Mental Health, which was in 1959-1960, Pichon-Rivière gives a definition of health that illustrates its quality. I quote, "A mentally healthy person is one capable of facing reality in a constructive way, of profiting from the struggle and converting it into a useful experience, of encountering more satisfaction in giving than in receiving, and of being free from tensions and anxieties, orientating its relationships with others to obtain mutual satisfaction and help, of being able to give way to a certain amount of hostility with creative and constructive ends, and of developing a good capacity to love. Butler's essay, mostly concerned with the vulnerability of fatal victims, does not speak of the experience of growing out of helplessness. Instead, regarding this maternal axis of vulnerability, she speaks of a masochistic enthrallment to abandonment. So most of the essay she's talking of the victims that are dead, and in that sense we can understand this common vulnerability as just our corporal vulnerability, she calls it, as just our exposure to death, that we can die from violence. But there is nevertheless this other axis that I've called vertical of childhood helplessness. But the example that she gives is the following. Is also not one of growing out of that helplessness, but she says, what is prematurely or belatedly called the I is at the outset enthralled, even if it is to a violence, an abandonment, a mechanism. Doubtless, it seems better at that point to be enthralled with what is impoverished or abusive than not to be enthralled at all, and so to lose the condition of one's being and becoming. The bind of radically inadequate care consists of this, namely, that attachment is crucial to survival, and that when attachment takes place, it does so in relation to persons and institutional conditions that may well be violent, impoverishing, and inadequate. If an infant fails to attach, it is threatened with death, but under some conditions, even if it does attach, it is threatened with non-survival from another direction. Unquote. To enthrall someone means to capture the fascinating attention of someone. Even if connected to a radically inadequate care, this primary enthrallment of the infant vivifies, in Butler's essay, the experience of vulnerability, relating it to the ecstasy that characterizes both sexual passion and grief. She begins talking by grief and our ecstasy or our experience of being besides oneself with grief. Insofar as even the most vulnerable can be enthralled to violence when it has no choice, this enthrallment perhaps makes for the complicity in violence that Butler opens with. I quote, I propose to consider a dimension of political life that has to do with our exposure to violence and our complicity in it, with our vulnerability to loss and the task of mourning that follows, and with finding a basis for community in these conditions. Unquote. So what Butler calls the bind of radically inadequate care, which what it does is it libidinizes an abandonment to violence, making us complicit in it. However, this is part of the vicious cycle or stereotype of violence. The recognition of this complicity, without the recognition of the asymmetrical vulnerability of the parts, risks immobilizing through guilt. The point is, of course, to heal those impoverished and abusive, impoverishing and inadequate persons and institutional conditions in charge of caring for the most vulnerable. To shift our attention from primary helplessness to primary enthrallment can, however, orient us forward in order to see how vulnerability may play in building a paradigm of learning. So in a sense, what I'm saying is common vulnerability really enough for orienting ourselves towards a non-violent ethics? And I'm saying it wouldn't be enough if we just take the mortality or what I call horizontal axis. It has to, we have to take into account this other vulnerability, which is that primary helplessness of the child and the capacity of growing out of it as one of the considerations. So we have thus, on the one hand, an appeal to make common common human vulnerability, understood both as mortality and as primary givenness to others. I think Butler's intention in this is more to say that we're primarily giving to the other, in a sense, or to found that kind of primary relationality that is even more primary than subjectivity, or that is at the root of subjectivity. The source of a non-violent vow to protection. So on the one hand we have that, and that would be the Butler's appeal, and on the other, the idea that this primary helplessness, with the amount of hostility and psychotic anxiety that it implies, and this is Pichon's argument in a sense, is also the source of pathology, and thus of the type of pathology that manifests itself as violence. So this primary vulnerability is not only, yes, it can be a source of ethics, but it's also a source of the hostility that is manifested as violence and of pathology. I have suggested, as in an earlier intervention, that we understand the task of recognition of this vulnerability not in the terms of a horizontal master and slave dialectic, as Butler does. The result, as we know, is a master and slave, but along the vertical maternalistic line of adopting this vulnerability, which is common as our own. And in this use of vertical and horizontal, we should be careful not to immediately identify the vertical axis with the hierarchical, and therefore the one that the evil side, and the horizontal as the egalitarian. I'm saying that there can be a vertical axis that is maternalistic, in a sense that is not pejorative, but also with the connotations and the dangers of that, which we may associate with paternalism. So this maternalistic line of adopting this vulnerability, which is common as our own. In the little time that is left, I would like to suggest the concept of a learning matrix developed by Pichon-Riviere's disciple and widow Ana Pampliega de Quiroga as a possible framework for the adoption of this vulnerability. So taking the cue from this primary enthrallment of the newborn, this kind of very lively curiosity that allows itself to even attach to something that is abandonment. But let's go back to that moment of before it attaches itself to abandonment. I propose that we end on the notion of birth as a paradigm of learning. Thus, the experience of vulnerability and exposure does not only imply proto-depression, but also proto-learning. Proto-depression was what Pichon-Rivière saw as this kind of nucleus of pathology that came with that first experience of being born prematurely. Birth, says Pampliega de Quiroga, I quote, is an unstructuring yet not devastating event. The baby can establish a continuity despite this rupture, and this is an articulation between the previous and the new given in learning, unquote. This articulation is possible because there is a body, a maternal body, to reconnect with, which allows at a basic level the structuring of experience, the passage from chaos to cosmos, as Piaget put it. Relevantly, Quiroga points out that one of the functions of this holding or maternal function is to be able to tolerate the hostility of the frustrated infant without excessive anguish, so that the baby can control its prosecuting object and internalize a good object. This internalization is constitutive of the ego and is necessary for the process of learning. In vital moments, as well as in moments of crisis, continues Quiroga, our need of holding pushes us to look for interlocutors. I quote, "These significant interlocutors, particularly operative in the process of creation, fulfill an ego function of holding and containment. And here when I say, she calls this thing which is basically the maternal function and ego function, and there is from the Lacanian perspective, we listen to or we hear ego psychology, but it's not quite the same, and I think it's important to also consider this idea of an ego function, of holding and containment. Such ego function of containment, holding, and transformation is required of groups and institutions which are in these and other aspects inheritors of the proto-bond and the primary family group. Unquote. Thus, in order to let a common vulnerability guide us away from violence and into a vow of protection, or perhaps better, towards a politics of care, it is necessary to articulate a project of institutions and spaces of learning that can become the adequate inheritors of the maternal function. Beneath the uncertainty and insecurity that exposes us to primary vulnerability, evoking the trauma type of birth, we must mobilize the stereotype of helplessness into a dialectic spiral of learning. And here perhaps I'm trying to move the discussion of knowledge to the discussion of knowledge within that bond, which is learning, the way that I understand the Pichonian theory of learning, which would be one that includes the bond. And here the bond replaces the object relation theory by saying that it's a two-way, it's understood in both ways. And what gets ill, in a sense, for Pichon is the bond itself. It also, in some way, replaces the idea of pulsion, or of a drive, or shifts our attention from the drive to the bond. But we can discuss that later, perhaps. So we must mobilize the stereotype of helplessness into a dialectic spiral of learning. The difference between unstructuring and devastation. I remind you of the quote that birth is an unstructuring yet not devastating event. So the difference between unstructuring and devastation is at stake. Thank you very much.